There are some killers you hear about and you just know this isn't some ordinary psychopath. This isn't just another murderer. Some people kill because of anger, revenge, greed. It makes sense in a way. But then there are the others. The ones who kill because they like it, because it makes them feel something. And that's what makes Danny Rolling different. He didn't just kill. He hunted. He turned entire cities into his own personal horror movie. He played with his victims like they were props in a nightmare only he could control. And the worst part? No one saw him coming. It was August 1990, and Gainesville, Florida, was just waking up from summer break. College students were moving into their dorms, meeting new roommates, planning out their classes, excited for a fresh start. It was supposed to be the best time of their lives. And then, within days, the bodies started piling up. It began with Sonia Larson and Christina Powell, two freshmen at the University of Florida, full of life, full of plans, just settling into their new apartment. They never even heard him come in. By the time the police found them, it was too late. Sonia was on the bed, stabbed multiple times, her body positioned like some kind of sick display. Christina was on the living room floor, her mouth taped shut, her wrists bound. She had been forced to watch what happened to her friend before her turn came. And just when people thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Because the next night, he did it again. Krista Hoyt was different from the others. She wasn't a college student partying her way through school. She was a hardworking, ambitious young woman with dreams of becoming a police officer. She had already seen the darkness in the world. She wanted to fight it, but she never stood a chance. Rolling broke into her apartment, just like before. But this time he didn't just kill her. This time, he took his rituals to the next level. When the police walked into that apartment, they didn't just find a body. They found a message. Because Krista Hoyt wasn't just murdered. She was decapitated. And her killer? He had posed her severed head on a shelf, facing her own body. It wasn't enough for him to take her life. He wanted her to see it. At first, the police thought maybe it was a one-time thing. Some maniac with a grudge, a crime of passion, something that could be explained. But by the time they found Krista, they knew the truth. This wasn't just some random attack. This was a serial killer. And he wasn't done. Because Danny Rolling, he was just getting started. By the time the third crime scene was discovered, Gainesville had officially become a city under siege. Students were sleeping with knives under their pillows, barricading their doors, leaving town altogether. Parents were pulling their kids out of school, demanding answers the police couldn't give. Because the truth was, they had nothing. No suspect, no leads, no motive. And meanwhile, Danny Rolling was still out there, waiting, watching, hunting. The next victims were Tracy Poles and Manuel Manny Tabawada, roommates, friends, two college kids who thought they were safe because they had each other. But Danny wasn't just looking for women anymore. This time, there was a man in the apartment. And if you think that stopped him, didn't. The moment Danny broke in, Manny fought back. He wasn't some easy target. He was strong, athletic, ready to fight for his life. But Rolling came prepared. Before Manny could even get close enough to stop him, Danny overpowered him with a knife, stabbing him over and over and over again until his body finally gave out. Then, like it was nothing, he moved on to Tracy. She had heard the struggle. She knew what was coming. But what do you do when you're alone in the dark and the only person who could protect you is already dead? You run, you hide, you pray, and maybe, just maybe, you get lucky. But Tracy? She wasn't lucky. By the time the police arrived, the scene was identical to the others. A brutal murder, a staged crime scene, a killer who had taken his time. 5 students, 5 bodies, and one man who had slipped into the night like a ghost. There was no forced entry, no clear evidence left behind. It was like he had never been there at all. And now, Gainesville wasn't just afraid anymore. It was in full-blown panic. The police had one goal now: find this guy before he did it again. But what they didn't realize, they were already too late, because Danny Rolling had moved on. And by the time they caught up with him, they'd realized they weren't just chasing a killer. They were chasing a man who had been doing this for years. And Gainesville? That was just the final chapter. The Gainesville murders didn't just shake the city, they paralyzed it. By the end of August 1990, students were fleeing in droves. Those who stayed moved in groups, slept in shifts, kept weapons within arm's reach. The university was emptying out, the once lively streets now eerily silent. Because somewhere out there was a man who killed for fun. And no one knew who he'd pick next. The police were desperate. 5 brutal murders in less than 72 hours, and they had nothing solid to go on. So they did what cops do when they have no answers. They grabbed the nearest suspect. And they found one, a troubled young man named Edward Humphrey. If you were looking for a killer, Edward fit the bill. He had a history of mental illness. He had a violent past. He had scars on his face that made him look like he'd walked straight out of a horror movie. And just days after the murders, he was arrested for assaulting his grandmother. The cops latched onto him immediately. The media ran with the story, splashing his face across the news. People stopped looking over their shoulders, stopped locking their doors, because they thought it was over. They thought they caught the monster. But the truth? The real killer was still right in front of them. And while the cops wasted their time on Humphrey, Danny Rolling was already on his way out of town. What no one knew at the time was that Danny wasn't some unknown drifter who showed up in Gainesville to kill. He had a trail of bodies behind him. He had been doing this long before Gainesville. And the first people who should have seen him for what he was have let him walk away. Because before he became the Gainesville Ripper, he was just another broken boy from a broken home. And that's where the story really begins. The problem with hunting a serial killer is that in the beginning you don't even know where to start looking. There's no name, no face, no past. Just bodies. And in Gainesville, that's all they had: 5 mutilated, posed, brutalized bodies in a city on the verge of collapse. But what they didn't know, Danny Rolling was already on their radar. They just didn't realize it yet. At the same time the murders were happening, the Gainesville police had been dealing with a separate case. A string of armed robberies. Nothing too crazy: convenience stores, gas stations, small places hit late at night. The guy never got much, but he always had a gun, a ski mask, and no hesitation. And just days after the last murder, they arrested a man trying to rob a supermarket. A drifter. A nobody. Living in the woods, hiding out in a tent, stealing what he could to survive. His name? Danny Rolling. But at the time, he was just another petty criminal. They had no idea who they had just put in handcuffs. And while they were questioning him about a simple robbery, they didn't realize that they were sitting across from one of the most sadistic killers in American history. It wasn't until they searched his camp that things started clicking. Because inside his tent, they found something strange. A cassette recorder, a diary, bags full of stolen items, and a stash of knives, guns, and tools. But the real clue? They listened to the cassette tape. And what was on it? Danny Rolling singing. Love songs, country ballads, rambling confessions. And in between the music, strange, eerie messages. About pain, about suffering, about the demons inside his head. It was the kind of thing that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Because this wasn't just some guy down on his luck trying to survive in the woods. This was something else. And then they found the screwdriver. The same kind of tool used to pry open the doors of the Gainesville victims. Suddenly, Danny Rolling wasn't just a petty criminal. He was a suspect. And when they ran his background, that's when everything fell into place. Because Danny Rolling? He had done this before. And Gainesville? That was just his final act. The deeper they dug into Danny Rolling's past, the more they realized Gainesville wasn't the beginning. It was the end. Because before he was the Gainesville Ripper, before the horror, before the murders, Danny Rolling was just a boy with a monster for a father. And that monster created another one. From the moment Danny was born, James Rolling made it clear his son was nothing. James wasn't just a bad father. He was a violent, abusive, sadistic man who treated his wife and children like they were inmates in his personal prison. He was a police officer, a man who was supposed to protect people, but inside his own home, he was the danger. He beat Danny's mother so badly she was hospitalized multiple times. He told Danny, from the time he was old enough to understand words, that he was worthless, that he'd never be anything. He killed the family dog right in front of him, just to teach him a lesson. Imagine being a child and learning that love meant pain, that family meant fear. That's what Danny Rolling grew up with. So when he started showing signs of his own darkness, his father didn't stop him. He fed it. Danny was a walking cliché of a serial killer in the making. By the time he was a teenager, he was already showing every warning sign. Peeping into windows, spying on women. Violent outbursts, setting fires, petty crimes. Fantasies of hurting people, of control, of revenge. And every time his mother tried to protect him, tried to get him therapy, tried to escape, his father dragged them back in. Because Danny wasn't just a disappointment to James Rolling. He was his failure. And by the time Danny turned 18, he became exactly what his father always said he would be. Criminal, a drifter, a man with nowhere to go, except deeper into the darkness. The next few years were a cycle of arrests, escapes, stolen cars, and violence. Danny bounced between jobs, states, prison cells, and crime scenes. But something was building inside him. The fantasies weren't enough anymore. He didn't just want to watch women through their windows. He wanted more. And then, in 1989, he acted on it. his first real crime, the one that should have stopped him before Gainesville ever happened. Because on one quiet November night, in Shreveport, Louisiana, Danny Rolling killed his first family. Shreveport, Louisiana, November 4th, 1989. The Grissom family was everything Danny Rolling never had. A father who was kind, a mother who was caring, a son who was going places. And for that reason alone, they had to die. It started like all the others. A break-in, a knife, a man who moved through the darkness like he had done it 100 times before. William Grissom, 55 years old. His daughter, Julie, 24. His grandson, Sean, just 8 years old. They never even saw it coming. William was the first to die, stabbed to death in his own home, his body left where it fell. Sean was next, just a child. No way to fight back. No way to even understand what was happening before it was over. But Julie was the one Danny wanted. And when the police found her, she had been brutalized, mutilated, and positioned, staged like a sick piece of artwork. The same rituals, the same twisted fantasies, the same horror that would be repeated in Gainesville. And yet, no one connected the dots. Danny Rolling walked away from that murder without a single consequence. No witnesses, no forensic evidence, just another cold case sitting on a shelf. And for the next year, he drifted, state to state, jail to jail, waiting for the right moment. And then, in 1990, he arrived in Florida. By the time he left, 5 students were dead. So now the police had him. They had his past, his murders, his weapons, his confessions. And in 1994, he was put on trial. But here's the thing about men like Danny Rolling. They don't go down quietly. They don't just fade into history. Because Danny Rolling, he wasn't done making people suffer. And even as he sat in a courtroom waiting to die, he had one last horror left to show the world. Danny Rolling knew he was never getting out. By the time his trial began in 1994, the evidence was overwhelming. The knife, the stolen goods, the eerie cassette tapes. It all pointed to him. But Rolling wasn't just another murderer trying to beat the system. He wanted attention. He wanted people to know who he was, what he had done, how much he had enjoyed it. And when he finally opened his mouth in court, it wasn't to beg for mercy. It was to sing. The trial was set to be long, complicated, full of witnesses, evidence, legal maneuvering. But Rolling had other plans. Because just before the opening statements, he stood up and pleaded guilty to all 5 Gainesville murders. Just like that. No fight, no denials, no games. Like he was checking off a box. And after that, he started talking, confessing, bragging, reliving it all like he was proud of it. He told the court how he had picked his victims, watching them, studying them, waiting for the perfect moment. He described how he snuck into their apartments like it was nothing, how he took his time, how he enjoyed the power, the fear, the suffering. And then, in one of the most disturbing moments of the trial, Rolling decided to serenade the courtroom. He sang, right there, in front of the victims' families, in front of the press, in front of the world. He sang a love song, like this was just another act in the play of his life, like he was entertaining an audience. And if you needed any proof that this man wasn't human, that was it. It took the jury less than 2 hours to come back with a sentence: death. And in 1996, Danny Rolling was officially sent to death row. But even then, he wasn't done. Because now that the world was listening, he had one last confession to make. Something that no one had ever connected to him before. Something that had gone unsolved for years. Something that proved Gainesville wasn't the beginning. Because on death row, Danny Rolling finally admitted he was the one who murdered the Grissom family in 1989. That first kill? That was his trial run. Gainesville? That was the grand finale. And in the end, the monster that his father created died exactly like he deserved. Danny Rolling spent 10 years on death row, locked in a cell, waiting for the inevitable. And if you think he felt remorse, if you think he wasted away in regret, haunted by the faces of his victims, you don't understand what kind of man he was. Because Rolling never saw himself as a monster. He saw himself as a legend. And right up until the moment he died, he wanted to make sure the world never forgot his name. He started writing letters, talking to journalists, building his own myth. He called himself the Gainesville Ripper, like he was some kind of movie villain. And the most disturbing part? He started comparing himself to Ted Bundy. He was obsessed with him. Both had hunted college students in Florida. Both had broken into apartments and attacked women in their sleep. Both had become infamous. The only difference? Bundy used his charm. Rolling used pure, sadistic brutality. And in the end, they both ended up in the same place, strapped to a gurney waiting for a needle. October 25, 2006. After years of appeals, Rowling's execution date was finally set. Outside the prison, crowds gathered. Some came to protest the death penalty. Others came just to watch him die. The families of his victims? They were there too, waiting, watching, ready for the nightmare to finally end. And Rowling? He never apologized. He never begged. He never once said he was sorry for what he did. Instead, he asked for a final meal of lobster tail, shrimp, baked potato, and strawberry cheesecake. Then, when the guards led him into the execution chamber, they asked if he had any last words. And just like in court, just like when he confessed, just like when he sat in his cell dreaming about the pain he caused, he started singing. His last words on earth? A gospel hymn. None greater than thee, O Lord, none greater than thee. And then, lethal injection. He was dead within minutes. For the people of Gainesville, it should have been the end. But the thing about men like Danny Rowling? They don't just disappear. Their crimes leave scars on families, on communities, on history itself. And if there's one thing his case proved, it's this. Serial killers don't come from nowhere. They are made. They start as broken boys in broken homes, raised by violence, shaped by cruelty. And if no one stops them, if no one sees the warning signs, they grow into something unrecognizable. Something that walks the streets at night, hiding in plain sight. Something that waits for the perfect moment to knock on your door. And that's the story of Danny Rowling, the Gainesville Ripper. Was justice really served? Or was he just a product of something even darker? Let me know what you think in the comments.